There are long histories of psychedelic use over thousands of years in large parts of the human population, and that is not limited to indigenous American populations or any other specific group. That's across all of humanity over many thousands of years. But then in the Western world, they've been forgotten, and psychedelics became mysterious and outside things to Westerners that weren't part of the culture for a long time, until scientists started looking back into it. And these drugs, despite the significant legal impediments to researching them, are now being researched, and that research is then fueling a change in public perception, which in turn is fueling change in public policy. We're at the point where the scale of access and use is now higher than the understanding from the research. So it's starting to be kind of unknowable consequences in quite how liberalized approaches to psychedelics are going to be.
Hey everybody, this week I am delighted to be joined by George McBride. He's a commercial barrister by trade, then turned into a drug policy reform advocate and an entrepreneur. So George has worked in a key role in the campaign to legalise medical cannabis in the UK at the NGO, is it Volteface? Is that how I say that? Volteface?
Yeah, it's said many different ways. I'd say that's the most common, but say it how it feels right to you.
Okay, it feels right. The NGO Volteface, before founding Europe's leading cannabis advisory firm, Hanway Associates, and industry conference Cannabis Europa. Most recently, George has co-founded Clerkenwell Health, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, psychedelic-specialty clinical research organisation and site network headquartered in London. So George, it's a pleasure to have you on, sir. How are you doing?
I am well, if as usual, rather sleep deprived. But thank you very much for having me on, James. Hopefully I can string a sentence together. Let's see how it goes.
You're very welcome. What's the source of your sleep deprivation, dare I ask?
You know, not to slag off my family, but I'd say my family are the main problem at play. Most entrepreneurs, it's their work ethic and burning the midnight oil. But, you know, I would sleep soundly if it weren't for my young children and wife, who are very noisy at the night time. So, yeah. Nice. Looking forward to it myself. We're expecting in December, so I get to experience all the chaos, the joy, and the sleep deprivation myself. So perhaps after this, I'll get a few tips off you. But yeah, interesting times. But listen, George, as I say, absolute pleasure. Some really interesting themes in your background, and obviously everything that you're doing with Clerkenwell. The psychedelic space, for me personally, and I know for a few people in the SomX team, is a fascinating space. It's fraught with stigmas and opinions and a really checkered history of research bans and all this sort of stuff, but obviously carrying so much promise, so much potential impact, so much legitimate, interesting clinical research going on. And I am really looking forward to getting into this with you. But before I do, whereabouts are you speaking to us from today, George? Whereabouts are you based? I am in presently sunny South London in my garden office, down in a place called South Norwood, if anyone's heard of it, at the bottom of the Crystal Palace Hill. Very nice. So, yeah, give us the long version, mate. So how did you get into all of it? Obviously, a commercial barrister, and there might be a story before that, and then advocate for drug reform, all the cannabis stuff, now in psychedelics. Like, how does one get into all of this? What's the story?
Yeah, I don't think mine is a path that is good sort of model to follow. And I think, unlike a lot of people, I'm a very reluctant, actually, unwilling entrepreneur. It's been circumstances that have forced me into it rather than like a long held aspiration. When I'm going now, this is the long version. So my interest at school, was, as most young people is, kind of determined by the successful older people that they meet and what they see as an avenue that's possible to take. So I had an uncle who had a really cool job, who was a district attorney in LA, and other mates of mine, when they did work experience, were doing things like the tills at Tesco. And he invited me to come and stay with him in Beverly Hills and shadow him for 2 weeks when I was 15. So I went out to LA and I shadowed him, and I got to wear an LAPD jacket, and they let me play with guns, and I was at the shooting range the whole time. And when I wasn't in the shooting range, I was in the courthouse, and the main thing I was there for was the preparation and execution of the raid of a meth lab. So in a place called Lancaster outside LA, and I got to attend the meth lab raid wearing an LAPD jacket, in a squad car and everything, and watch it happen.
Outrageous.
Yeah, it was quite exciting. And the Americans, obviously, this is, a while ago now, 2 decades plus behind me. So things were still quite loose, and they were like really excited to have an English kid that they could give a gun, and thought it was hilarious, So, I really enjoyed it. And I thought, the law looks fascinating. I was also frankly appalled at how the drug war was being, conducted in the US at that time, when it was all 3 strikes and you're out, clearing neighborhoods, pursuing really aggressive enforcement and filling up the prisons, and not much seemed to be getting better for the communities that I saw in the deprived parts of Los Angeles County. And so my uncle had every good reason to be quite right-wing, authoritarian, and quite pro enforcing law and order. And I get on with him well still now. He's a judge in California now. And we still we probably agree on a lot more than we used to when I was a kind of idealistic teenager. And I was very much of the thought drugs should all be legalized. No one should be being arrested for simple possession. This stuff should be being produced to pharmaceutical standards in controlled environments where they're free from violence or these drug compounds being adulterated or, in any way, just as far away from meth being made in people's kind of caravans as possible. My views have shifted as I've grown up, but that really excited me. And at the time in my family, there was a lot of substance abuse problems. There was a lot of mental health problems, and my life kind of came defined by drugs and mental health issues, more so as it went on, but looking back on it right from day one. So I really wanted to be a barrister, which is how my uncle had started. And I thought it was a good career. And my backup career was to be a scientist, but I hated chemistry, so I dropped it at AS, and then I wasn't left with the A levels I needed to do science. So the decision was made for me. I went to be a barrister. I was very, very convinced that I was going to defend drug users, drug dealers, that sort of thing, that I'd get into the criminal law. But as I went through my education, more and more people were deterring me from the criminal law because it was so poorly funded and so difficult to make a career out of. My dad then had quite a bad psychiatric incident and ended up in residential psychiatric care for a while, and then lost his job. We had to sell the house while I was at university, and financially it became obvious that I wasn't going to be able to pursue a career with like a £15,000 starting salary if I wanted to look after myself in London, which I did. So I changed tact and thought I'd become a commercial barrister, which is very well paid, 4 times the starting salary, private banking at Coots, like just a very, very different job. So I did that, but it is a very, very different job. You're not in a court. You're not in the things that I like is the excitement, going to prisons and courtrooms. Commercial law is very much writing long letters sat in an office. So I hated it. I really, really hated it. I was very lucky to be one of, if not the youngest barrister in the country. I started my job when I was just turned 22, and it was a great opportunity, but I wasn't aware of how great of an opportunity it was. So I spent all the money and more money that I didn't have. I lived for the weekend, and I ended up kind of focusing more on partying and not on the job. And as a result of that partying and the trouble it got me into, I ended up resigning from my position as a barrister at the age of 23. So I'd spent all this time and effort getting into it. When I started my pupillage, there were 4 people fighting for 1 or 2 jobs, and everyone else was in their late 30s or at least 30 plus. And they were a lot more mature and focused, and they knew that they wanted to do this. I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew what things interested me, and I knew kind of where my skills lie. But I ended up dropping the job and not having a clue what I was going to do. And that gave me what now see as a positive opportunity to go and try a load of other different things. So now I'm a lot more well-rounded and a lot less just an expert in one thing. But through my experience with drugs and the law and the situation I got myself into when I was a barrister, I then started following all the drug policy organizations like Drug Science and Release and the Beckley Foundation and all these organizations that have been around for a while, trying to change our drug laws to better protect the public and drug users and better protect our criminal justice system. So I went out and did other things. I became a travel agent at Harrods for a bit. I went and did all sorts of different weird and wonderful things, mostly sort of business development related. And then my friends were building a startup for the 2015 general election. They were building a polling company that was going out and gathering the data to see who was going to win that election. So I got involved with that. And that was really exciting because it was a proper startup. Like, we got the contract, we had to deliver it. We had to go and hire hundreds of people on short-term contracts to come and work. We had to build a big call center and do all of the polling for the general election. And it was super exciting and stressful, and I loved it, but I also kind of hated it, which I think is familiar for anyone listening with entrepreneurial background. And it got me more politically engaged, and I started to care more about the underlying issues. And because I was somebody who was an outspoken drug user with a family with serious mental health problems and substance abuse problems, and I was also a professional. Normally professionals can't talk about drugs. Doctors often do drugs, they don't talk about it. Lawyers, they don't talk about it. Engineers. And it's not because of the police, it's because of their employers and their regulators, because you can get in much more significant difficulties with drug use if you're professional. So the British middle class tend to be quite reserved or even duplicitous in the way they speak about drugs because of the stakes. And it tends to be more working class and upper class people who speak freely about them. And that gave me a kind of interesting insight into being one of the few people who actually spoke honestly on the issue. Well, honestly, from my own lived experience. So I got more involved in it. I did I'd done like a little event with David Nutt, the professor at Imperial, who was famous for getting sacked by the government for saying that horse riding was more dangerous than taking MDMA when he was the drug czar. And I'd done an event with him and stuff, and I'd started thinking about that as a career, but I'd gone away after the election when the work was done at the startup and thought I was going to become an investigative journalist. So I went to Nicaragua to investigate this canal that was being built to rival the Panama Canal. And I went out filming in the jungle in the English-speaking part of the country, which is a really fascinating place. And I thought I did a really good job. But then I realized that I'd been in the jungle for like 2 weeks, and I'd put my camera in waterproof casing that obscured the mic, and I had no audio on any of my recordings. So I'd been meeting all these people who were having their land taken away from them and all these Chinese commercial interests coming in. And I'd filmed, hundreds of hours, 100 hours plus of footage, and none of it had any audio. And I was like,
that is heartbreaking.
Oh, this isn't for me. Very heartbreaking, but was a good realization that I don't think I had it I had, what it takes to be an investigative journalist. So I went back to like Spanish school and thought I'm at least going to improve my Spanish while I'm here, get something out of it and look for a job. And then I saw a job come up at the Beckley Foundation, which is run by a very, very interesting character, Amanda Fielding, who's been at the kind of heart of the drug policy debate in the UK for decades. And she was looking for someone for a project that they were doing about drugs, that wanted someone with a knowledge about cocaine, cannabis, psychedelics, with a working knowledge of Spanish and legal qualifications. And I thought, how many disgraced barristers are there out in Nicaragua learning Spanish with an open history of being on the wrong side of our drug laws?
Yeah, you're at least in the top 10 there.
I thought it was like it was made for me, and it looked amazing. This big stately home that Amanda lives in. I didn't know anything about her, but I rang my dad, who was a hippie in the 70s, and he was like, she's wild. Some of the stuff she was up to in the 70s made all of us look like straight, and my dad had hair below his waist. So he was really excited. Amanda, I rang about the job. My qualifications were perfect for it. So she just said, like, get on a plane, come, I want to interview you. I flew back. My dad drove me down to Beckley Manor, and I had the interview. It went well, and I started working with her at a really crucial time for cannabis and psychedelics and wider drug policy. It was 2015. Cannabis companies were just starting to list on Canadian exchanges. So you're seeing like real corporate cannabis for the first time. Amanda and Imperial were releasing the results of their LSD brain imaging study, which created that really famous picture of the increased interconnectedness between different regions of the brain. And there was a public awareness of the psychedelic renaissance for the first time outside of academic circles. So I got to spend a lot of time with people like David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris, and also all of these early cannabis entrepreneurs who were trying to see what was going to happen in Europe. So I got to go and like take a delegation from Jamaica to the UN. Amanda was advising the Jamaican government about legalizing cannabis, and we were working with Imperial on the research side. And I just met all these really amazing people and had a really, really, really mind-opening time with her at the Beckley, and that's where it all kind of flowed from.
That's awesome. No, what a story, man. You are a very passionate man, aren't you? And you talk very passionately about multiple different things, which is incredible, because if you're going to sort of build an entrepreneur from scratch that has the ability or is resilient and has multiple skills and, can learn from different, you would probably do something similar and throw them into lots of different things and lots of different situations. And, some of it quite unwelcomed, I imagine, like, difficult family situations and health issues and that kind of thing. But also like what you've done very intentionally, which is incredibly high achieving in law, incredibly early and learning a trade, but then actually not allowing yourself to be defined by that, which I think is fascinating. Like not even close. In fact, almost rejecting the label of barrister, and particularly commercial barrister, clearly. That I almost wonder in your story what would have happened had you have pursued criminal law, and actually had you have been standing up with drug users and actually defend. Like I do wonder when you tell that story. Like I wonder how things might have been different at that kind of sliding doors moment. But from that to going into the polling startup and learning and loving, by the way, from the sounds of things, like the chaos and you talk about the chaos and the stress, and then saying how much you actually enjoyed it. I think that's quite interesting, of like figuring out how you work and how your mind works. But dude, there's so much that I want to talk to you about here, and before we even move on to the company and what you're doing, and half of it probably isn't justified on something called the Healthtech Podcast, but I'm going to extend that definition quite broadly so that I can talk about things that interest me here. Like anyone that actually wants some healthcare and technology can switch off, so that's absolutely fine. This is my microphone. I can do what I want with it. I think what you've said, that the middle class don't talk about it, and actually the working class and the upper class can speak freely. I think that's really, really interesting, and it's something that I obviously have observed. Like you said, a lot of doctors take drugs. They can't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it for fear of what it might do to how employable they are, their GMC registration, and all the rest of it. I actually wrote an article for Forbes on this exact topic quite a number of years ago, on the fact that so many doctors do take drugs and do abuse drugs, and all of the problems downstream that actually leads to. You know, one of the big contributing factors being that they can't talk about it freely. And actually, if they go from a place of recreational use to actually something a bit more difficult, they're in this zone of finding it incredibly difficult to actually then reach out for help for what it does for not only their employability, but also identity and things like that. And this takes me to a place that I'm fascinated by, which is just drugs and where they are in culture. And this relates to and where they are in kind of how we perceive them as varying different cultures across the world. But this sort of relates to like where you are now and what you're doing. But what's your view on, I guess, where we've been and where we are now with how drugs are perceived? And I want to kind of go actually quite deep with you on this, because you're someone that has experienced this from so many different vantage points, that we have receptors in our brain for, and I'm talking as an anaesthetist here and as a medic, right? We have receptors in our brain for these drugs to work on. Is that not evident? I'm not contributing my view here at all, but is that not evidence that these drugs, at least in part, are designed to work on us? Is that not evidence that in some way humans should? And many cultures would say it is. And there are many cultures in the world that use psychedelics very regularly, even in spiritual and religious terms. And it seems in the West, we have a very different mentality that, as you say, criminalization and everything that comes along with that criminalization. And I think in the West, it's very difficult. I'm the least person on this podcast to be talking about this, but I'm just sort of framing it for you to come in and talk about this. But there's a lot of tension there because, like I said, people find it difficult to talk about. They're criminalized. They're used, though, by people. They expand people's consciousness. People have many good experiences with them, but a lot of them do have addictive nature, and then people end up in problems. So I think we're at a very confused place. That's where even when I look at the world and all the rest of it, it feels like we don't have a single narrative. It feels like in the West, we're conflicted on so many different things. But what are your thoughts on where we are currently with this kind of confusion between benefits versus criminalization, and they're awful?
Yeah, we are in a very confused place. And sadly, I don't think I was expecting more movement over the course of my life from where we were with the drug war in my teens, particularly in the US, but also around 2001, arrests for drug offences in the UK peaked. And there was, a lot of, enforcement in terms of drug use around 2000. And I thought things were going to change a lot. In some respects, they have. The vast majority of Americans have legal access to cannabis. There are states where psychedelics are legal. There are whole countries that have changed their attitudes to drugs. So there has been a shift from the complete, international consensus on drug prohibition. But in terms of how people actually conceptualize drug use, sadly, I don't think we've moved on at all. I think it is still very much their good and bad buckets, and people lobby and do PR work very hard to try and say, oh no, cannabis is a useful medicine for people undergoing chemotherapy and everything. It's a good drug. And things like smoking that were socially acceptable become the subject of social opprobrium, and they get pushed down and stigmatized. And I think there's an important part in stigma and drug use that is useful. And a lot of people just talk about destigmatizing drug use. I think there should be some stigma to drug use. You know, you shouldn't be drinking brandy with breakfast and stuff. We have good rules with alcohol that help make weddings fun and jobs workable. People know that you don't drink brandy when you're at work, and they know that it's okay to do that at a wedding. But that we have a really big problem. And then you've got the kind of more hippie side have that view that, you know, we have the receptors, the plants or the fungi or the whatever it is, the toad, make the chemical, it works in our brains, it creates this amazing experience. So this is almost like a divine situation. And there are whole cultures that view drug use with that divinity, and they're legally protected in the US and in other jurisdictions. You know, Rastafarianism is protected across a lot of countries in the Caribbean. You've got a lot of indigenous drug use protected in places like Mexico and the US with peyote and mescaline and other drugs, and in Latin America and in the Far East in places. So there are all these other ways, but then I like to be a rational scientist about things, and I can see that, you know, in large part, it seems like these drugs are around because they're good insecticides, and it just happens to be that most animals have the same receptors, and something that might totally stop an ant from eating a plant might also make a human high. And these are just happy coincidences as far as I'm concerned. But I think the more deep and fundamental part of it is that humans do seem to have some inalienable desire to alter their states of consciousness. And whether that's, you know, as escapism or introspection or for medicinal purposes, it's there. Everyone can see it. You know, people seem to have a need to get high, to get into an altered state of consciousness. And there seems to be both good and bad in that. You know, there are a lot of really interesting stories about how the rise of MDMA use led to decline of football hooliganism and these kind of weird changes. And we're going through one of these huge generational shifts in the US at the moment, where now many more young adults consume cannabis than alcohol. And, you know, they have limited money and they have social rules around their drug use. So when you get a new drug coming in, it largely leads to other drugs declining. So you have to figure out whether there's a net benefit there to society or not, and how you want to deal with those trends that are in part precipitated by legal change, but in larger part are social trends that then laws follow. And I think it's really, really complicated. Growing up, I was an idealist when I was younger. I saw a lot of drug use. I had family members getting arrested. I had, you know, I watched all these things play out, and I thought, this isn't helpful the way we're dealing with this at all. And I remain firm in that, but I remain less firm about the solution just being legalize it all, because, you know, that does create harms of its own. It is an incredibly complex picture. It's just a shame that it's become such a reductive debate when there's a lot to be gained here, not just in terms of what I'm focusing on at the moment about the potential medical applications of psychoactives, which I think is now well understood, but also in terms of the social benefits of creating the right kind of rules and social attitudes towards drugs that encourage more positive behaviors and let people understand that there's, you know, there's good experiences to be had, but there's risks with everything. Like everything in life is a risk, you know, whether you sit down or get in your car, or none of it is risk free. All of it is risk management. And the thing that really upset me getting into drug policy was how much abdication of that risk management there was. You know, you've got festivals like Glastonbury that say that they are a no drug environment, and they say it, you know, with a straight face, and everybody involved knows that people are going there to do drugs. The organizers, the owners, the police, the security, everybody knows what it's about. And yet nobody is willing to talk about it in realistic terms, apart from very few academics and charitable organizations who kind of get involved, places like the Loop with drug testing and, you know, small organizations like that who are actually willing to talk about it and say, look, this happens, and how do we make it safer? There's a lot going on there, because I don't want to get into the whole like divinity thing, because some people just, now in America, a big trend is for it to be about plant medicines, inclusive of fungi, as if just anything a plant makes is fine. But, you know, I wouldn't go and suggest somebody go and chew on some oleander leaves or something, you know, or there's so much of it in nature that's designed to kill or to harm or maim. Just because it's natural doesn't mean we should then be saying, oh, it's fine. And there are plenty of powders you can make in a lab that carry very low risk. I don't think that we should be just trying to identify some drugs, whether they're natural or whatever, and say these are good and have another bucket of bad. All of them are very complicated.
So for people listening, in order to understand the health tech opportunity that exists in psychedelics, I think people need to understand a little bit of the history of psychedelics, because the opportunity now is in the research space, and that opportunity has not been around for in any kind of meaningful way over a meaningful amount of time. And it seems like an area that people have had to fight for. So why is that? We could even start with, what is a psychedelic? Why is it that we have not treated psychedelics as other drugs like we would do when researching their potential benefits in things like mental health conditions? And what has changed recently? So can you plot that history for me?
Yeah, sure. It's a long and checkered history, but it's important to understand that there is decent, although fragmented evidence that there are long histories of psychedelic use over thousands of years in large parts of the human population. And that is not limited to indigenous American populations or any other specific group. That's across all of humanity over many thousands of years. There's good evidence that psychedelic drugs have been used. But then in the Western world, they've been forgotten. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about the role of the Catholic Church and the stigmatization of women as witches and the practice of medicine and all that stuff that was involved in that. But whatever, a lot of that is lost to history, but there's interesting conversations to be had there. But that happened, and psychedelics became, mysterious and outside things to Westerners that weren't part of the culture for a long time, until, scientists started looking back into it. In particular, in the Victorian times, there was some really interesting investigation into drugs like mescaline, and they really excited some of the intellectuals who found them and used them in terms of their potential. And so there was a bit of a nice period in the Victorian era where scientists were freely able to speak their mind, publish papers about these compounds, explore them personally and in a research context. But it was before modern science was particularly robust. There was then a kind of largely racist attitude to drugs that developed in a large part due to the way that Westerners used alcohol to destroy cultures as they moved. There was then a big problem with other foreign cultures' drugs, and a lot of fear around what they might do to Western society. So we saw from opium being banned in the Western US as they brought in a lot of migrant labor from China onwards, we saw drugs that created interesting experiences in the mind to be banned. And to your point about what a psychedelic is, it means mind manifesting. It's not like a strict scientific term, because you've got different compounds that act on different receptors. And as you know, as an anesthetist, you know, there's the experiential thing and the method of action. And this isn't a strictly scientific term. So some people would include ketamine and MDMA, some people wouldn't. But we're talking about drugs that create powerful shifts in your perception of the world around you and within you, and things that really alter the way your mind works. And those drugs then fell out of favor. And then there was a bit of a mini renaissance in the 50s, largely flowing from Hoffman's discovery of LSD, which Sandoz went on to manufacture, and then it went out into the clinical research environment in the 50s and 60s in the US. Then it got taken by the counterculture, and then it got banned as the counterculture was aligned with anti-war and anti-Jim Crow laws and all of that sort of stuff. Then Nixon used it as part of a political tool to suppress opposition. So the research fell out of favor. And I think the saddest thing that happened when we reached the kind of international consensus on drug prohibition was that the science went too. So we largely saw from when these drugs started being banned in the 60s onwards that rather than just banning them outside of a research environment, the barriers that were put up to researching them were pretty much insurmountable. So from the late 60s through till the early 2000s, there was essentially no research, apart from research, by nationally sanctioned agencies into the downside of drugs. There was little or no research into psychedelics, for that whole generation. And then we saw attitudes shift, and that was largely after enforcement had reached a peak again in sort of 2000 on both sides of the pond, and people started to listen when people said that there were medical applications here and things that should be researched outside of the harms of these compounds. And that took a while to build some steam, and then seems to now have finally built some steam. And these drugs, despite the significant legal impediments to researching them, are now being researched. And that research is then fueling a change in public perception, which in turn is fueling change in public policy, which then means now the thing is kind of running away from us. And we're at the point where the scale of access and use is now higher than the understanding from the research. So it's starting to be, kind of unknowable consequences in quite how liberalized approaches to psychedelics are going to be. But Americans are kind of grabbing onto this, and we're seeing Washington, Oregon, Colorado, elsewhere, all building frameworks to legalize these substances. So now it's all happening, and there is a lot of excitement about the research. There's also a lot of condemnation of it from people who are either morally opposed to it or from people who quite rightly have very strong feelings about how robust the research is. These are notoriously difficult compounds to research because of blinding issues and subjective effect measurements and the diagnostic issues with psychiatric health conditions. So there are these really complicated things that make it really hard to research. And we're just at a really interesting moment where MDMA has just been rejected by the FDA. And we don't know now whether these drugs are going to be included into the pharmacopoeia of mainstream modern medicine, or whether they're going to become alternative healthcare options. But it looks like there is enough gathering pace that it will happen through one channel or the other now, and we just don't know whether they're going to be included in modern medicines or not.
It's absolutely fascinating, and obviously it's interesting hearing that they're putting structures in place in America following. And they, having already done this through cannabis, there's obviously a structure and a blueprint to follow. And it's funny because I read about there was a DMT, I think it was a DMT study that they were doing at Imperial. DMT, for those that don't know, is known as a very powerful and potent psychedelic. And it was so interesting for me, like reading that was being done at Imperial. If I'm in London at the time on my phone, it's like, around the corner, there's now people in a research and a lab environment taking something that I'm only really associating with people taking in like the Amazon and having these like wild experiences. And it's funny because as an anaesthetist and previously an anaesthetist and, manipulating consciousness for a living, is how I describe it to a lot of people. I became very interested in consciousness, and I became very interested in what different faiths and different cultures thought about consciousness. And so therefore psychedelics were always interesting to me. Yeah. And because I've obviously been interested in the psychedelic side of thing, I've been interested in what that
is, and therefore what that means. These are all very deep questions that I'm not, having worked in medicine and academia and research, I know that the requirement for understanding and control and a hypothesis to test against and testing environments and all these things. And it's fascinating to me that that is very counterintuitive to even what we know of the psychedelic experience, particularly that of the DMT experience, this very sort of otherworldly, other realm. And the Imperial study, I believe, was trying to find out, is this other realm consistent person to person? Are there consistent experiences that we could legitimately hypothesize everyone's going to the same place? You know, definition of place being interesting there. And it's this now just opens up, and it's like exponential how fascinating this gets the more and more layers you might peel of all of that stuff. And I can see the research world grappling with how do we test and control this to build into narratives. And I can see that psychedelic world just being delighted that things are being tested and that side of things. But how do you see what's going on with research in psychedelics now? What's the lie of the land with all of this research? Is there research going on? Oh, I know there is, but like, could you talk about research that's going on potentially directly tested against certain conditions with certain compounds? And, you know, how far reaching do these types of studies go with, you know, testing for consistency in realms? And are there consistent beings in other realms that people, and this is serious academia that's happening. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And the kind of work that we do at Clerkenwell Health is very much developing, the data that's needed to approve a medicine. So we're just looking purely at, you know, can this be administered safely and create, you know, efficacy in terms of affecting somebody's mental health condition. So we don't get into much of that more exciting academic, you know, are these realms consistent? But we do have to deal with some of the issues that come up. You know, are you going to talk to people in their preparation session before they do DMT or 5-MeO DMT, which is a considerably more powerful version of a similar drug? Are you going to tell them, well, you might meet aliens, you know? So
yeah, how do you consent for that?
Yeah, exactly. Because are you then prepping them for that, which goes on and could potentially be unethical? But also is the failure to mention that there is a consistent recurrent pattern where people believe they've met entities from another plane or another reality. Is the failure to prepare them for that negligent? If you're going to leave them going out into the world thinking, oh my God, there's aliens, they're real and I've seen them, you know, I'm pretty skeptical about, you know, trying to explore the consistency and that stuff. I think, you know, a lot of it is hallucinatory and there are reasons why it would be consistent from person to person. I'm more interested in the way that it augments our perception and what that helps us understand about the world that people build in their head that they think is the real world, which is the reality of why we have such bad mental health problems. You know, people just passively, what we do all the time is build a world in our heads, between our heads and the real world. And we say that is the real world. But for a lot of people, that is not the real world. A lot of people have this conception of the world as being this awfully hostile environment that's full of disappointment, and a simple change in attitude could dramatically affect their perception of what the world actually is. So I think, to me, there's obviously something potentially useful there. Whether or not we could actually refine it into a really successful commercial product is a much harder question. But there's something that's obviously interesting there to me. But we have to leave a lot of the more interesting work to the academics. And what we have to do is just iterate on how this can be done as a treatment in a clinic and whether this can actually work to help improve people's lives. And a lot of that doesn't require understanding how it actually does it. It's just, does it do it? And it's as basic still in mental health research as just reading out a questionnaire to somebody. You know, you'll be familiar with some of the rating scales, and the way mental health research conducted is still quite almost laughably basic. It's just asking somebody, you know, are you happy? And them saying yes or no on a scale, and going through a bunch of those questions. So the whole thing is lacking in more credible, objective measures. Psychiatric research is done on subjective measurements, and these drugs that affect your subjective perceptions and seem to have the potential to affect the subjective perceptions of the investigators, which is another thing that people are concerned about.
Yeah. And let's get into some of this now. So I love that yes, you can take all of this, but you guys are focused on the practical. You guys are focused on, here are some problems that we can solve. Here's now something that we have, you know, jurisdiction and license to test in an academic environment, and let's go out and find some practical solutions to some very practical problems. So can you talk me through that? So what exactly do you do? Who do you do it for? Who approaches you with a problem? How do you solve that? How does one set up a study? What you know, when do you bring in functional MRI versus a questionnaire? And talk me through what you guys do and how you solve problems for people.
Yeah, amazing. And so I know Healthtech Podcast audience, it's hard to pitch at the right level. Some of you will obviously understand this really well, and I'll be, you know, teaching out of set eggs, but I'll try and use quite like intelligible lexicon. That's two words that aren't very intelligible to everyone.
I'm also delighted that 46 minutes in, we are actually going to talk about some health techs. For those that have got to this point, you're probably going to get what you were after.
So biotechs, small aspirational pharmaceutical companies, you know, they go out, they do a drug discovery process, they find some interesting compounds, they test them on rats, mice, and other animals. They get an indication of whether they think they're going to work in the human brain, and they think, because of analogous research that's been done on analogous compounds, maybe this will work and this is worth trying in humans. And then they get to us. Then they've got a drug and they've got the seed of a hypothesis, and they come to us and we'll help them design the study in a way that's going to produce the data to justify their endpoints so that they could use it in a package to submit to a regulator to say, look, this medicine's safe and effective. And we help them design the research in a way that's going to produce that outcome that they can then use to get the drug approved. And then we go further than a lot of CROs who just contract out all of the research. And wherever possible, we go and do that research ourselves. So we have a licensed clinic in London. We have another one opening in October. We're going to open these clinics across Europe and then hopefully the rest of the world. And we can actually find the people who need the help, who are looking for innovative investigational treatments because standard of care hasn't worked for them, or whatever they can get access to hasn't worked. We find those people, we bring them into the clinic, and we deliver the drug, and we write up all of the millions of pieces of paper that need to be written up, so that we can build that up into a data set that can be interrogated to see if it actually works. And it's really challenging. You know, the most advanced developer in the field is MAPS, and they've been through the whole FDA three-phase research process, submitted a new drug application to them, and then had that denied on the basis that even though on their own reading of their own data, there was 68%, I think, or around high 60s rate of remission for the people that they administered MDMA to who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, the FDA said no. And that's to do with the study design, and that's to do with the study delivery. So 68%, by the way, when we're with mental health conditions, unlike, you know, I had shoulder surgery and the doctors informed me before I went in for it, this has a 99.8% success rate. Wonderful. Modern medicine at its best. Nearly every time they do this surgery, the person's shoulder gets better. If you go for treatment for your depression or anxiety, you're normally looking at somewhere between 35 and 40% likelihood of efficacy of an intervention. So 1 in 3 people are going to get better. For 1 in 3 people, there'll be no effect. And a lot of those people are going to get worse too, because they've tried to treat it and it hasn't helped. And now they've got another drug in their body, or they've got that disappointment of it not working. So these interventions that we have at the moment don't consistently work for large groups of people. So MDMA looked like it was hugely effective, but there were problems in the design. There were problems in how the research was run, and that created enough doubt in the FDA's mind in this particularly politically contentious area to say, we don't know from this data package if this works. They're not saying it doesn't work. They're just saying the data you have given us does not conclusively lead us to believe that this is safe and effective. So that study was designed in 2017. We set up in 2020. We've been trying to fix that problem. We saw some of the problems with the MAPS design and how it was being run. And we really wanted people to run more robust research. We saw people being better funded. We wanted better design studies being run more objectively and robustly. And that's not to criticize any of the wonderful work that went on MAPS. And I know that a lot of people were significantly helped on that trial. And I know that there's still a lot of promise in that treatment. So I'm really hoping we'll see further research there, but I'm really, really hoping that people listen more to those who are critical of the research field than to those who laud it, because there are very significant, robust problems with the way the research is being run, which is why people are critical of it. There are a lot of people who think this is some pharmaceutical industry conspiracy, but pharma is an amoral business. I'm not saying they don't try and do what they do to maximize profits. They do. But I don't think there is some conspiracy to prevent, more effective treatments reaching the market. I just think the psychoactive drugs are very hard to research well. And I think we need to do it really well and get an answer, one way or another that is conclusive to say, right, well, that was a very well-designed study that's been run very well on a powered study. We're confident in the design. We're confident in the quality of the data. We're confident there's been no misconduct, and we can now conclusively say if this is safe or effective. And sadly, we're not there yet. A lot of us hoped we would be there. Whenever it was a couple of weeks ago when the FDA made their decision on MDMA, but it looks like we might now have to wait until around 2027 for Compass to complete their psilocybin research.
Wow. That is a wonderful explanation, by the way, of how the quality of the research actually leads to impact. And it's something that obviously I know if I think about it, but it's not something that immediately comes to mind of just how valuable of a part of the entire journey that actually is. And it's funny, isn't it? It's almost, I can see how this company is like a full circle moment for you with everything that you've been passionate about since you were young and wanting to get into this sphere. You've just wanted to find the point at which you can make the most impact. And it's a really, really fascinating one to pick, because clearly, like that example with MDMA, it placed enough doubt in the FDA's mind. And it's legal terminology, beyond reasonable doubt, and you're always trying to prove that and the burden of proof, etc. But you're right, like the CRO has such a responsibility there, and has such a responsibility to their client, the pharma company or whatever it is, to design and execute all that stuff in the right way. And is that, I guess, the thinking behind having control of the whole chain as much as possible and actually doing that research yourself in your own clinics?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where it came from. We saw this and we thought, we want to be at the heart of the patient access to these investigational treatments. And where is that? It's in clinical trials. And how do so we started looking at how do clinical trials work now? And we had some experience because we built a cannabis advisory business that had been working with people doing cannabis research. And, I'd worked for contracting for GW Pharma and others, and I'd seen they'd done really successfully with their drug candidates and how they'd managed to take a cannabis compound and push it through a pharmaceutical process that it's not well suited to and end up with a drug that they can sell. And I was really interested in how we try and support that. And I think clinical research had become this thing that's predominantly done by these huge organizations with tens of thousands of staff, normally more than 50,000 in these big, large CROs, but that it was all about subcontracting out the actual delivery. And the psychiatric research hasn't had much focus for the last 20 years. So when we built our psychedelic clinic, we were building it because we wanted a Schedule 1 pharmacy we could hold the drugs and where we could do this. And there wasn't one. And we knew there wasn't one outside of academia in the UK. So we built it. But what we didn't know is we were building the first purpose-built commercial psychiatric research unit in Europe, because this research still just happens at hospitals. It still happens in places that aren't well suited to it. So we really wanted to redesign how would you do this properly if you could do it any way that you want, rather than just working with what exists, which understandably is what pharmaceutical companies do. They say, well, where is there a psychiatric hospital that we can put a room on the ward and do this? Even though, you know, who wants to do acid in a psychiatric ward? I really can't think of a worse place to have a psychedelic experience than in the Bethlehem or somewhere. You know, the Bethlehem's a very good psychiatric hospital, but, you know, it is what created the term Bedlam. And, you know, Bedlam and an introspective psychedelic journey don't really go hand in hand. So we thought, like, let's just clear out all the other crap, all the sleep trials, all the physically ill people, and let's just have a room with a therapist, a psychiatrist, a nurse, a pharmacist, a lab, all the stuff you need and none of the stuff you don't need. And let's try and see if us being at the heart of it means we can control it better. And we've been able to largely. We've been able to dramatically improve on retention rates compared to our competition. We've been dramatically improved on recruitment rates compared to the existing places that were doing it. We've been able to really focus in on it and do it better because it's all that we're trying to do. And through doing that, we've realized that I think that there's a larger shift going on now in clinical research, where those large clinical research organizations now understand it has become too expensive to go and contract out dozens, if not hundreds of different hospitals all over the world and have them all doing this while they're doing everything else that they're doing and deliver high quality research. And we're now seeing large CROs start to bring in site networks, start to want to control more of that development process. And I think that's a much bigger shift in how clinical research is done. I don't want to overplay it too much because there was a big hype about, you know, decentralized clinical trials, and a lot of that didn't come to bear. But I think that this is going to come to bear. I think what people want is larger networks of working with the people who are actually going to do the research, not working with people who are just going to go and procure it for you, because that's fine if you're doing an oncology trial, because there are hundreds of really good oncology centers all over the place. So fine. But in new innovative modalities or under-researched areas like psychiatric research, it just really doesn't work. So I think and I hope that we're going to see it. And we'll have to see it despite investors, not because of them, which is always a shame, because investors don't want like old-fashioned business models that have a lot of staff, high overheads, bricks and mortar. Yeah, it's not sexy like AI. You can't just go and say, well, I've got a proprietary technology. It's totally scalable. You know, I employ a few devs and that's it. You actually have to say, well, no, I'm going to build these things that need all of this stuff in them. So we have to go and like push against the trend in investment, which is to invest in scalable, people like businesses, and start saying, no, we need a people heavy business and we're going to do it in the right way. If we build it large enough, then private equity and stuff like those types of businesses. So I think we could get the right funding, but we're going to have to really grind over the next couple of years with the investors that we've got who understand the model to get it to that critical scale where it then becomes attractive to people who can write larger checks. And it's not going to be like Californian VCs, you know?
And this is the thing. And that's what I was going to say, is that I was chatting to a VC turned private equity guy recently, and
You're saying the same thing, that actually even those bigger firms now, the PE firms, are looking at earlier stage investments, and they're able to make quite interesting earlier stage investments because they're not looking for the 90% gross margins of a SaaS business. They're actually looking at smaller versions of something that could grow into something that the main mothership private equity firm could then invest in. And it was just a very interesting conversation with him saying that actually, yeah, he started to notice that there are these even smaller firms popping up, like people leaving those PE firms, putting together a smaller fund and actually, taking more of like a scale up approach into the private equity side. So, but again, cognizant of, they're more comfortable with those brick and mortar margins, which I think is fascinating. One question I was going to ask you, so with all the research that you have done and are doing and everything you put together, you mentioned obviously the environment being a big factor there and contributing to the success of accurate results. Are there any other things that you've noticed that other people could perhaps learn from that are listening that also are contributing to the quality of research? Are there ways that your methodologies are set up, or anything that you sort of noticed broadly that perhaps people don't pay enough attention to or do slightly differently? And I don't know, have you noticed any trends in actually the way that you set up your studies for success?
Yeah, I have. I think one of the biggest ones that we've noticed is the way that we recruit and train people. So again, the way that this is normally done is just find people who can do it, hire them and get them to get on with it. And because there was so little experience in this field, we had to start hiring much more on character and potential aptitude than experience. We had to hire experience in as well, but then we had to build the whole training program, and we trained all of our first clinicians at our own expense because we didn't want to charge anyone for the training because nobody even knew who we are. We're now moving into a phase where we can charge for some of that training because we're giving people real job skills. So that's become a line of business, not a large material revenue stream compared to the actual conduct of the research, but it's something that we're doing. And I think we're now offering it as a service to larger CROs who want to work with us, where we'll say, look, we'll actually thoroughly do the recruitment training and monitoring of your staff to ensure that they're adhering to the study protocol and that they're suitably trained to be effective in delivering this, which had been something that was largely being missed by CROs as well. A lot of the way that it works was just contracting out risk and just pushing risk down. But they were pushing risk down to companies that operate at low margin in an intense field with a lot of safety concerns. So they weren't necessarily, it doesn't create the quality just by forcing the risk down on the smallest party in the process. So this, I think, is a really negative thing that's happened very naturally from CROs seeing scale as the main thing that determines long-term success. And I think now we are starting to see a lot more stratification. So like I think, who was it? Anderson or whatever, one of those big VCs in California talked about bundling and unbundling taking place in industries. And I think we're at an unbundling stage with clinical research, where these big organizations have bundled everything together for scale, and that gives them like this concrete kind of reliability. It means that they get good investors in, they can weather storms, but they've lost quality and focus. And now we're starting to see people unpick them. We're seeing like interesting companies like Lindus Health, who are funded by Peter Thiel, saying, well, what would a tech entrepreneur do building this tech stack that supports research? And that's really exciting. And they're doing some really interesting stuff there. And we're seeing other people just focus purely on niche areas within the ecosystem and saying, how do we do this much better than the big guys? And how can we focus rather than just try and be the biggest and broadest? And I think that's going to lead to a lot of change. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether the purchasing power of the large companies means that as soon as any of those smaller focus companies get to the right scale, they just get sucked up into the big businesses, or whether they can start to come and take over a whole segment of the market and just be like, no, we are the data management people, we are the statistics people, and we just do this better now, and there's no need to get this service from the large CROs. I don't know how it's going to pan out.
I love that unbundling framework because speaking to a lot of health tech entrepreneurs, especially ones raising at the minute, so many people just feel like it's a race to the bottom and it's a race for margin. And especially when words like LLMs are being thrown around left, right, and center, it's sort of become, LLM has even become like a signal of, yeah, well, we don't pay humans, we just get an AI to do it, and therefore we make margin. And everything seems focused on margin. But I think it's great that actually if people if on the investor side of the table, they're now looking at this and realizing that, hold on a minute, the short-term margin doesn't actually equal exit. It doesn't actually equal good exit. It doesn't mean meaningful scale. It might mean quick short-term scale, but then everything falls over, and the over-reliance on then other people doing other things and contractors and this, that, and the other, that actually if we're moving to a place of more understanding about, okay, lower gross margins, more humans in the loop, actually higher quality, in-house training, all the rest of it, all these things might drop margin, or not eventually when you monetize them. In your case, maybe not so. But that contributing to longevity as a business model, if that is what returns to investors, then actually further down the line, it might start to get noticed a bit more. And the questions come more on the way that your business is structured than actually just how cheap can you get it towards a SaaS model, a change that's much needed in healthcare.
I think so. And not just in healthcare, just across investment. There's loads of charts being shared over the last couple of years showing like how VC capital has moved, and it's moved from fixing big problems to just obsessing about quite small problems. And because they're just obsessed with the way that they work. And I think that model has worked for a long time, but it doesn't seem to be working anymore. Hence why the PE people have to start creating their own pipeline. And I don't think we're going to continue to see this just VCs just throwing everything behind, right, who can do, do cab rides the best, who can deliver groceries the best. I think family offices, early stage PE people are starting to go back to basics and be like, where's a big problem with a potential, large commercial impact in the long run, and who are the experts trying to fix it? And let's actually listen to them, and let's actually see if there's, but it's not there yet. Like, it's a bit of the seed of a change, but the reality is still, like, I've been laughed out of the door a lot of American VC places because it's just like everybody else just has a molecule or a big ream of code, and they're just saying, look, I found this incredibly niche thing within healthcare, and I can show that I'm 30% better than the niche thing that does it already. And I would like to see a few more dreamers trying to re-envisage healthcare and not just keep going in and make these incisive efficiency gains on little components within it, because it's the model that we've got and you can't just flip the table over on it. But there are ways that it can be fundamentally reimagined in a way that in the long run is going to make money. And I do think in the long run, it does have to make money. And we're going to have to prove to investors that this is going to work. But I would love to see more people trying to reimagine things rather than just make incremental gains in efficiency and margin, because it's boring. The world in 10 years is going to be so different from the world we've got now. It's crazy to think that everyone's just going to need a slightly more efficient tool for their little niche thing. It's not bad to make more efficient tools. I'm not anti it, but it's odd that they're the only thing that gets invested in by most of the people with the biggest pots of money.
George, listen, mate, this has been an absolutely awesome conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It must be really satisfying, actually. This is the sort of journey that you've taken on your career, isn't it? And now that you've found that meaty problem and you're building a company of substance and value, and also in the macro, but then even in the micro, you're helping other companies do that too. When they come to you with that research problem and trying to prove something, and you're then helping them do that. So you're sort of multiplying your impact every time. It's not as if you're tackling one problem, which is really nice. You're tackling lots and lots of problems within this enormous problem of psychedelics and making sure that they create the impact that they can. And I think that's awesome. The final question that I've got for you is, for you, which compounds are most exciting right now and for which indications?
I think there's a hugely exciting thing about short acting intense experiences. So we work for a number of sponsors who are developing compounds that are, similar to 5-MeO-DMT, which is the most powerful known psychedelic, but the subjective effects of the drug only last about 15 to 20 minutes, but they also affect your perception of time. So it feels like longer for most people who do it. But there's something really interesting there, because there's a commercial viability to that intervention of being able to go have a life-changing shift in perception in what could be a 1 to 2 hour clinic visit. It's really exciting. Those shorter acting, really intense compounds do excite me. But I also am excited about the complete other end of the spectrum. I'll be a little bit too frank here. I think you speak to a lot of psychonauts, people who do drugs, that LSD is the best, is the outcome that a lot of people say. LSD lasts 10 to 12 hours, and it is a trip. And that's why the word trip comes. You go on a big journey, and at the other end of it, you almost inevitably see something differently from how you started. And part of that is the duration. So I would love to see what the outcome of people like MindMed looking into these longer duration of effect compounds is, and because if you can show the efficacy, then I think, just because you've got to bring somebody into a clinic for 10 hours, I don't think that's the be all and end all, just because it doesn't fit with conventional healthcare. I think like what we're doing, you just have to build a different point of access that doesn't comply with that same idea of what a clinic visit looks like if you're going to make that work. So it's exciting. There's so many different compounds, from things that last 15 minutes to 12 hours and everywhere in between in development. The work at either end of the spectrum kind of excites me at the moment, because they present the most interesting opportunities to change how we think about these things. But it all excites me in terms of the compounds. I'm quite compound agnostic. I think a lot of these drugs do similar things in similar or different ways, but at the end of the day, it's the experience for the individual that seems to drive the efficacy. So I'm pretty compound agnostic. I hope we don't just go to the place where the only compounds that are being funded for research are very short acting. I hope we can see what differences come out of those really different experiences. I'm excited about the whole thing. I just really hope that we can maintain the excitement. Now, a lot of people were sharing the Dunning-Kruger graph about psychedelics, where it's, that peak of inflated expectations and then the valley of despair, and saying we're in the valley of despair.
Trough of
I actually think trough of disillusionment. That I think we're actually on the slope of enlightenment, or whatever you call it, now, just at very early stage. So I would love to see the continued enthusiasm, and I hope that this sector isn't just a flash in the pan created by the money that was all the silly fake money floating around in 2021. I really hope that it attracts long-term focus, because I really think in the long run that we're going to see some amazing outcomes if people stick with it now beyond the hype, and do the hard work and know that it takes, 5 or 10 years to develop a medicine, and hundreds of millions in capital. It's not easy. But I think the opportunity is there, and I don't think anything's happened to detract from the hypothesis that these might be hugely useful tools in psychiatric care.
And I think history will look back very favourably on yourself, George, and what you're doing with Clerkenwell Health. So, I appreciate you for everything that you're doing. For those people that want to learn more about Clerkenwell Health, what's the best way for them to do so?
Get in touch, visit our website. I'm not really on socials at the moment, but if you go, we are, so you'll get through to one of my colleagues. If you check out our socials, go to clerkenwellhealth.com. Do reach out. You can follow us if you just want passive updates, but we are very collaborative, and if people reach out, we'll do everything in our power to get back to them and answer their questions. So please engage and speak to us. We've always got job opportunities. We've always looking for new partners. We are very chatty, so please just get in touch through whatever channel, and I'm sure we'd love to speak.